Hello, welcome to Political Thinking, the programme in which I have a conversation with, not an interrogation of, someone who shapes our political thinking about what has shaped theirs. My guest this week is the Chief of the Defence Staff, Britain's top soldier and the Prime Minister's top strategic advisor, General Sir Nick Carter. Once again this week, the cry has gone out to call in the army. Call in the army to help deliver fuel. Call in the army to deal with the fact the NHS in some places is running out of ambulances. Call in the army to help deliver the vaccines. We believe in the value of our armed forces, and yet all this comes at a time when there are real question marks about what has gone wrong over the past 20 years. Wrong in Iraq and, of course, wrong in Afghanistan. General Sir Nick Carter, welcome to Political Thinking.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's a great privilege to be with you.
You only have a few weeks left in this job after, 4 decades in the armed forces, in the army. Do you approach the end of this time? I'm sure you'll tell me it isn't retirement. Do you approach it with trauma, with relief, with excitement?
Gosh, it's mixed emotions. As you say, I've been institutionalised now for between 43 and 44 years, and it's going to be quite a wrench, I suspect, leaving the institution. But on the other hand, one has to look forwards, and I think there are all sorts of opportunities that will come from that. And I have to confess, the last sort of nearly 8 years as a Chief of Staff, first with the Army and now as CDS, have been relentless. And I'm actually looking forward to spending a bit more time with my wife and my family and my golf.
And the last 8 weeks have been pretty relentless as well. We'll talk about the Afghan withdrawal later on, but it has led to personal criticism of you and other leaders of the armed forces. Is that just at a personal level a painful, a frustrating thing? Because you've got to always answer back, haven't you?
Yes, you are not necessarily in a position where you can answer back. And of course, criticism is painful. But on the other hand, one has to realise that you're communicating nowadays in modern media to multiple audiences, and you can't please everybody. I think what you have to do is to be true to yourself, true to the advice that you're giving. And if you're doing those sorts of things, then I think you can probably find a way through it.
Is it also the case that, frankly, people who do my sort of job, people who write commentary, people in politics, in this era have very rarely had any service? 20, 30 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case.
No, I think that's a very fair observation. And I think particularly my generation, which has served in the campaign since 9/11, we've lost a lot of people killed under our command. And that has a marked effect on you. And I often say that not a day goes by when I don't think of those people who died under my command. And not a day goes by when I wonder whether my plan could have been a better plan. So I think that responsibility of command that comes with the job that I ultimately do is something that a lot of opinion formers don't necessarily understand.
I want to reflect a bit on those times you had and those conflicts and what we can learn from them. Let's begin, though, with how on earth you ended up where you are. Was it always going to be the army for Nick Carter?
No, definitely not. No, it wasn't until I comprehensively ploughed Oxbridge. And my father was very clear that red brick universities went on his sheet.
What, failed to get into Oxford and don't bother? Why bother with the others?
Why would I send you to Winchester rather than to go to Oxford? Yeah. So on the basis of that, it was, I suggest you, young man, go in the army for 2 or 3 years and then maybe a professional qualification thereafter.
But he'd been in the army, hadn't he? You were born in Kenya, where he was serving.
Yeah, no, he had. He did half his life in the army. And then he left and went and worked in insurance in the city. And yeah, he thought the army was a good career. I think he was rather surprised that I stayed and I profited in it, but nonetheless he thought it was a good thing to do for 3 years.
It almost went horribly wrong, didn't it, at Winchester College? You got kicked out of the Cadet Force.
Yes, I wasn't a terribly successful cadet, it has to be said. I was drawn to the golf course and not to wearing my uniform on a Wednesday afternoon, and I got caught out. So having reached the dizzy rank of Lance Corporal, I reverted to private soldier.
What, simply because you've gone to play golf?
Well, I think I was sort of, absent without leave, probably. So they weren't impressed with that.
Yeah, and the theory was that you would join the army, leave, and then do what?
Well, I think my father thought accountancy, and he had a good mate who was ran Smith & Williamson, and the answer was that I was going to go and work for Smith & Williamson. Anyway, 3 years into it, I was enjoying myself, and I wrote to the friend of my father and said, I think I'm going to stay.
What kept you in? Why the love of it?
People, first and foremost, responsibility, interesting places, interesting tasks, Northern Ireland, United Nations tours in Cyprus, and the opportunity to do more things like that.
You look back to those of you who served during what we euphemistically call the Troubles. Huge responsibility at a young age. Was that a traumatic thing to live through?
Yes and no. I mean, I only did 6 months at Sandhurst. I mean, nowadays they do a year. And then before you'd command a platoon, you'd have done a platoon commander's course. And remarkably, in those days, I was commanding my platoon in Northern Ireland 2 weeks after I'd finished at Sandhurst. I was, I think, just 18 years old. And I remember arriving in Londonderry, having driven from the overnight ferry in Belfast, got it wrong, drove up the Falls Road by mistake, but miraculously found my way to Londonderry.
Not the ideal place for a soldier to be found.
No, and all my kit was piled up in my little Mini. Probably there was combat dress on display as well. We were a bit naive in those days. But I remember arriving in Ebrington Barracks in Londonderry and being told, get your uniform on, your company's going on an operation tonight and you'll be commanding your platoon.
Commanding a platoon, which you know and knew would have been the target of the IRA.
But for sure, yes. I mean, we were going to go and do an ambush on a bridge on the road that ran out towards the Glenshane Pass, which was a very notable place. Veterans will know very well what the Glenshane Pass was like. And it was an extraordinary thing to do. And my company commander came and listened to the orders I gave a few hours later. My platoon sergeant was very much there to make sure they were decent orders, to keep an eye on me. But yeah, you were thrown in at the deep end. And it was one of those circumstances where I guess you sink or swim. But people wanted you to succeed. And I think the system around you wanted you to succeed.
And you did succeed, but you succeeded, and some say this in praise, others as a criticism, as what sometimes people call a political soldier. You get drafted in to make plans for politicians and in government. When it comes to the Gulf War back in 1990, after Saddam Hussein has invaded Kuwait, you're involved in the planning of that.
Yes, I mean, I was working at the time for what was called the Land Deputy Joint Commander, a general who sadly died now called Mike Wilkes, who'd been a former SAS officer and Director of Special Forces. And he was the first general officer to travel to Saudi Arabia in late August to talk to General Schwarzkopf about what Britain could do.
Storming Norman, as he became.
Indeed. And he wasn't really quite as storming Norming as he was. I mean, we arrived in his office at about midnight, I think, having flown from the UK. And it was very clear in the conversation, that was quite a short conversation, that he looked at Mike Wilkes' SAS wings on his arms and he said, Mike, he said, I don't want any ... special forces. I've got plenty of those. I want tanks. And I remember writing tanks in my notebook.
In the first of what became a series of mass mobilisations, a series of major conflicts in which Britain and America were fighting side by side, you must be aware now that many people look back at those, not the Gulf War, but what some call the Second Gulf War in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria and Libya, and they say they all failed. Jeremy Corbyn, who once was seen as a marginal figure who warned against foreign interventions, partly came to office, I think, in part because people said, well, he was right about that, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I think failure is, of course, a powerful term. And I think it's interesting to reflect on, whether we failed to win battles. We certainly probably didn't succeed in winning wars, but we probably didn't fail to win the battles. And I also think, particularly in the case of Afghanistan, that it's too early to say whether it was a failure. I don't know whether you want to return to that, but, I would observe that 60% of Afghans have been born since 2001, and they will want a very different Afghanistan to the one that the Taliban have inherited.
We'll come on to the detail of that Afghan withdrawal and the lessons learned from it in a second. I just wonder what, if any, conclusions you can draw from the fact that not one, not two, but a whole series of military interventions have not succeeded. Was it that we perhaps got over cocky, that the political class, and maybe the military too, had seen success in Kosovo, had seen success in Sierra Leone, had seen some success dealing with Saddam Hussein, of course, in the Gulf War, and thought, yeah, we can do this. We can make the world a better place.
Yes, and I think if you look back, you'll recall that sort of era was about benign interventions. And you'll remember that Robin Cook and Tony Blair had a view on how we could make the world a better place. But I think it's deeper than that. And a lot has been written about the interaction between senior military leadership and policymakers. And I think that how that relationship works is pretty fundamental to the lessons that we learn from the campaigns of the first 20 years of this century, because the military has a very important responsibility to make sure that they receive the right political guidance. And policymakers have a very important responsibility to make sure they give the right political guidance.
Is there a difficulty that you're hinting at in the way the military talk? You are, by definition, can-do people. Some people describe it as happy talk. No, we can do this. It's going well. Partly because you've got to motivate men. You're asking people to risk their lives. And politicians, particularly those without any experience of service in the armed forces, can mistake that and think, oh, well, they say it's going to be fine. Can't go wrong.
There is definitely something about leadership and the importance of being positive in leadership. Because if you're asking people to do difficult things, dangerous things, and often things where they could lose their life, you're hardly likely to get them to do it if you're not positive in your approach. But of course, you have to be realistic and you have to be pragmatic. And you said something earlier about me perhaps being political in my approach. The answer is I'm fundamentally not political in my approach. And behind closed doors, I'm very clear with policymakers about what we can and cannot achieve. In public, though, I'm not necessarily going to reveal my advice because I don't think that's my constitutional position. Rather, I think I'm obviously going to try and be positive when it's appropriate to be positive.
Well, you said very candidly that in a sense it's too early to know whether our withdrawal of Afghanistan marks a moment of failure. Why so? How could it ever be anything other than a failure, given that the people who are currently running it are the very people we turfed out 20 years ago, and they don't seem to have changed very much?
Yes, I mean, I think Afghanistan has really only been governed inclusively. Probably last time was probably in the 1960s and early 1970s. Since then, it's never really had an inclusive government. And of course, what you now see is one gang of Pashtuns coming in who have a different view on everything. And the answer is that they are not going to succeed in the way they are going to govern, because they are governing in an exclusive way. So I'm afraid we are likely to see some more bloodletting. And that is something that, many of us predicted in June and July this year. And that bloodletting perhaps will lead in a few more years to a recognition that they've got to form amongst Afghans a government that can govern all Afghans. And I think that because 60% of Afghans have been born since 2001, they don't want to return to the Middle Ages. I think they perhaps will encourage their country to think more inclusively about how it should be governed. And that's where I have hope.
Well, let's go back to some of the things that did seem to go wrong. Did British politicians not pay enough attention to the fact that in the United States they'd made a really cross-party decision to get out and to get out quickly?
No, I think the National Security Council understood all of that.
Knew that Biden might set a very early date to get out, because it looked as if people were taken by surprise.
I don't think anybody was surprised by the decision that President Biden took. I think, I'm on the record as saying that it wasn't necessarily the decision we hoped for. But I think the die was cast in February of 2020 when President Trump signed that deal. I mean, the die was then with the Taliban. The die was then cast. Although May this year was set as a deadline and it was subsequently extended to August, the die was cast at that point.
So the people who argued, people like Tony Blair, for example, that we could have just carried on as we were, that there were no casualties at the hands of the Taliban for our armed forces, and therefore, why didn't we just stick with the status quo? Was that a delusion?
I personally think so, because I think the Taliban would have gone on the offensive against us, and you'd have had all of those, green on blue casualties we saw, and all the IEDs back again. And I think we'd have had to have markedly reinforced our presence on the ground.
Well, let's go back to your own service in a way, because yes, you were in charge as Chief of the Defence Staff, but of course you served for many, many years before that in these various conflicts. If you go way back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, you were not there, but you were doing a fascinating job at the heart of government.
Yes, I was. In 2002, I did my first tour in Afghanistan, and I got very involved in nation building, if we could put it like that. And I designed things called provincial reconstruction teams. And I got a bit of a reputation for understanding how one might rebuild states after they had collapsed. So I was brought into a joint team in the Foreign Office, which was essentially about aftermath planning. And our job really was to try and encourage the coalition, led by the Americans, to think the thing through to the finish and to think hard about what might happen once Iraq was essentially defeated militarily. How would you then put it back together again? And it was a very interesting job to be doing.
Well, fascinating. in particular because it's the one thing everybody thought failed most comprehensively, failure to plan for the aftermath.
Indeed. And these were things that I think some of us had some questions to ask about. And indeed, of course, we well know that this was comprehensively covered by the Chilcot inquiry.
But
and
in
all
other
of
words,
the,
if I look at the papers you were writing then, you would say that you did foresee.
I think we were very worried about how this would work out. And indeed, all of that, was revealed during the Chilcot experience.
Now, later on, you are serving on the ground as a commander in Basra. You will be familiar with this charge. I suspect it's one that frustrates you. But there's an old joke in the American army which says, how many Brits does it take to clear Basra? To which the answer is none. They couldn't hold it, so they sent for the Marines.
No, I do remember all of that. And that happened 3 or 4 years after I served there. And the answer is, I think that the people who were involved at the time, they thought that they had come to an accommodation with the forces of the Iraqi military on the ground, and they thought that it was going to prevail. I mean, the plain fact is that, of course, Basra became very much a target of the insurgency, and it became a target, I think, of outside influences from Iran as well. And the upshot of all of that was it took the forces of the coalition as a whole to resolve it.
And yet, in a sense, don't we see the exact mirror in Helmand, where you're then even more senior in the army, in charge of, 55,000 troops or so in Helmand province. And again, heroic efforts made. I think I first met you when I travelled with David Cameron to Helmand province, and I walked around places I wouldn't dare to walk now. But it collapsed again. The Americans had to come in.
Yes, I mean, I think that if you look at southern Afghanistan as a whole, and it's not just Helmand, it was Kandahar as well. And Kandahar, in many ways, was the centre of gravity of southern Afghanistan. It's, of course, where the Taliban emerged from back in the 90s. I mean, the answer is that if you were going to adopt what became described as a population-centric approach to counterinsurgency, you were going to need a lot of troops. And at the beginning, I think people were not trying to do that. The mission began to change over time. And by the time I was there in 2009, President Obama had signed up to the so-called surge, and that's why so many troops arrived. And our job was a very different job to the one that people had at the very beginning.
Another view is there was never going to be a military solution. We had to sue for peace. And you will know there were people, even as the surge was taking place in Afghanistan, said this is the moment now to say to the Taliban, we need to do a deal.
Well, you will remember when we met each other with David Cameron in 2013 when he came to Helmand, that I was in a certain amount of trouble because the day before I had given an interview to the Guardian newspaper, to Emma Graham Harrison, in which I had said we should speak to the Taliban. And David Cameron was not impressed with this, not least because it was against policy, but also because it stole all the headlines. And you will also recall, I suspect, that we went back up to Kabul, where we were given an audience with President Karzai, who turned to David Cameron and said, you must promote this general, because he has said what generals should have been saying since 2002. And the answer is that you are never going to solve this problem unless you bring everybody into the tent. And of course, if you look back at the Afghan mission, at the very beginning, it was not a mission that was about nation building. You'll recall that the Bush administration didn't do nation building. It was about bear hunting. And therefore, it was entirely appropriate for them to work with some interesting characters, a whole load of warlords and those sorts of people to do the bear hunting.
Bear hunting, in other words, looking for bin Laden.
Bin Laden and people like, and Al-Qaeda more generally. But of course, once that had happened, it was then very difficult to start nation building when, of course, you actually needed to be working from the ground upwards. And of course, I think when people look back at that, they can see that the campaign evolved. But by then, we'd probably made a misstep before.
There has been a big debate going on about how our armed forces should be configured in the future. A big review came out, so-called integrated review. Lots of talk about concepts that many of us barely understand, the grey zone, fighting wars without actually fighting, the importance of cyber and so on. Does what's happened in Afghanistan make us have to think, well, hold on, before we abandon all that stuff about mass mobilisation of men and women, let's just remember we still need an army.
Yes, and of course, some of the challenges we're having with tanker drivers and things at the moment would absolutely explain why you still need to have a force of, if you like, national resilience. But the bottom line is that, we've already learnt a lot of lessons from the Afghan campaign. And we know very well that if you are going to get involved in these sorts of environments again, you need to have the basic insight and understanding in order to be able to have an effect. And if you go in there absent that insight and understanding, you are going to fail. And we've already begun to get the army in particular to be restructured and reconfigured to be better able to be engaged with indigenous forces in areas that potentially can become failed states, in order to help build the capacity of those local forces to be able to take the problems on for themselves.
Is it also a question of what public opinion will tolerate? You referred to your generation in the armed forces as the post 9/11 generation. Isn't it possible that public opinion here, public opinion in the United States in particular, will say after Afghanistan, after Iraq, after Syria, after Libya, no thank you, we don't want any more of that for a long, long time?
They may say that, but of course it depends what sort of world they want to live in. And we've never had a more interconnected world. And if we are not prepared to compete in that interconnected world, then we'll discover that it might not be a world that we want to live in.
Why so?
If we're not careful, we'll end up in a world with totalitarian surveillance, and we'll end up in a world where the sorts of values that we don't espouse will be imposed upon us through that technology. And that's why I think we need to recognise that if we want to stand up for the free and open way of life that we have, we are not going to be able to put ourselves back into national stovepipes. We have to become part of the global enterprise. And that's why we need to be involved.
You mentioned another role that the army in particular are playing at the moment, what you call the force of national resilience. When the politicians ring you up and say, can you help us with the vaccine? Can you help us because we haven't got enough ambulances? Or now this week, we need fuel delivered. Are you pleased, or is there a bit of you thinks, why didn't you get your act together on your own without relying on us again?
Well, it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, I often used to say as head of the army, and I still as the Chief of Defence Staff, that the armed forces have probably never been more popular emerging from the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. But that popularity has been entirely based upon sympathy and not on empathy. So the opportunities to do the Olympics or to support the government in COVID or to drive tankers in a fuel crisis, these are opportunities for us to show ourselves off and to show the qualities and the values that we stand for. So the answer is, on the one hand, I'm, clearly see this as a positive opportunity. And of course, it's what we do. And it's why the government gave us a massive uplift in funding in November last year. But equally, we have to recognise what our proper role is. And that, of course, is to deter these opponents that we're up against in the global environment from fighting us.
You have been, in the words of that musical Hamilton, in the room where it happens. You've advised Prime Ministers Cameron, May, Johnson. What do you make of the quality of the national leadership that we have, and whether we have people who really understand the world in which you in the armed forces would want them to?
I think that I have found, sitting around the National Security Council table, that the system's not bad. I think that the people who sit around that table obviously come at things from different perspectives, not least recognising the different departments that they front up to. I think they're very well advised. I think we still produce very good national security experts and professionals. I think our intelligence services are world class. So the answer is, I think that provided politicians are prepared to listen and to take the advice that they're given, and then obviously to apply the politics to the advice they're given, then I think we'll be fine.
Not bad and fine are not the highest form of praise. It sounds to me like you're doing what you have to do, which is you make do with the people you're offered up.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I serve the Prime Minister, and fundamentally we live in a democracy, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
What's fascinating listening to you, and in particular in that last answer, you're preparing, as it were, your own career obituary because you're about to give up the job. You will know you are going to get some pretty bruising obituaries. Not so much because of what you've done, but you've been around when people have perceived that the military force has failed. Do you have moments late at night or elsewhere where you look in the mirror and think, is the basis of much of what I believed in wrong? Have we just not been able to do what I spent my whole life, my whole career hoping we would be able to do?
I think you have to look back at what our principal function is. We have avoided war, throughout my lifetime. And I think that ultimately that is what we are here to do. I mean, I often say to the Chiefs of Staff, we need to think really hard about how we prepare to fight the war we might have to fight, because that, of course, will prevent that war from ever happening. And ultimately, that is our principal task. And yes, of course, when you get involved in the complexities of these very complicated campaigns like Iraq and Afghanistan and the other things that we've seen since the Cold War came to an end. Yes, they're incredibly complicated and they're politically charged and they're febrile in media terms. But the brutal reality is that I will look myself in the mirror and I genuinely believe I did the best thing I possibly could, given the circumstances that I lived through. And I do hope that when people think about writing bruising obituaries, they do recognise that from the day I became the Chief of the Defence Staff on the 11th of June 2018, a week later, I was in front of Prime Minister May and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Helmand, to make the case for more resources. And the fact that we achieved that effect in November last year when the Prime Minister gave us an extra 24 or so billion pounds over the spending review period is something I shall look back on with a degree of pride.
General Sir Nick Carter, Chief of the Defence Staff, thank you very much for joining me on Political Thinking.
Thanks.
There is no doubt that politicians want a can-do attitude from those who run the armed forces. They come to believe that they can offer something that mere mortals in the civil service or in private corporations can't actually offer. And yet General Sir Nick Carter and other generals now find that they're being criticised for not stressing enough what can't be done. That's it from this edition of Political Thinking. Thank you for watching.